Welcome everyone to the Phoenix Report. I'm Jack Connor, and this video is part of a series of what I'd like to call a fireside pitch, in which I share with you some creative storytelling ideas that I have for a particular movie or series or franchise. As you know, I've done many reviews on this channel of movies and TV shows, but I figured I'd challenge myself a little bit to come up with some story ideas of my own. I try to think if I was in charge of rebooting or remaking or in charge of making creative decisions for a popular movie or TV series, what would I do? After all, it's easy to be an armchair quarterback and critique, a movie or show that already exists, but what kind of story would I tell if I was a screenwriter or someone in charge of making those decisions? So you're about to find out. Today, I want to talk about the Marvel Cinematic Universe, specifically Avengers Infinity War and Avengers Endgame. Now, when those movies were released in 2018 and 2019, they were a massive achievement. Certainly the high point, arguably the peak of the Marvel Cinematic Universe. This was the culmination of a story that built up over 20 separate movies and over a decade of storytelling, featuring a massive cast of characters that became household names, and they transcended pop culture. Everybody knows what a Marvel movie is now. It's an incredible thing. What they've managed to do. However, there's one aspect of those two movies that never quite sat right with me, or at least they left me with a lot more questions than it did answers. And the biggest question for me is what really happened to Steve Rogers after Avengers Endgame? And that's what we're going to talk about today. It has been a highly debated question among fans ever since that film was released. Even the movie's directors, Joe and Anthony Russo, as well as the script writers, Christopher Marcus and Stephen McFeely, they've had a few theories as well. So first, let's talk about what we know. At the end of Avengers Endgame, we saw that Captain America, Steve Rogers, chose to remain in the past with Peggy Carter after returning all the various Infinity Stones to their particular places and times that they got them from. The Avengers used some time travel shenanigans to make that happen. And at the end of Avengers Endgame, like I said, he went back, he chose to spend his life with Peggy Carter, and we eventually saw an elderly Steve Rogers in the present day hand over his shield to Sam Wilson, the Falcon. However, Endgame introduced some very particular details about the rules of time travel within the Marvel Cinematic Universe. They were a little bit different than say the rules of time travel in Back to the Future or the Terminator movies. As we learned in that movie, it was pointed out that traveling into the past doesn't necessarily change the future. It instead creates a separate timeline that branched out from the main timeline, or at least the one that we know, creating infinite possibilities without changing the future of that main timeline, the one that we know. So, toward the end of the movie, like I said, Steve was tasked with returning the Infinity Stones to their proper places and times. And it was assumed that him doing so would cause those other timelines to cease to exist, that everything would kind of converge into the main timeline, and that there wouldn't be all these, there wouldn't be all these alternate timelines that happened because of that. However, as we've seen in the Loki series on Disney Plus, in the movies Doctor Strange and the Multiverse of Madness, Ant-Man and the Wasp: Quantumania, and several other MCU projects, the multiverse is still very much a thing in the Marvel Cinematic Universe. I know that in several interviews, Christopher Marcus and Stephen McFeely have implied that Steve Rogers had in fact existed in the main timeline of the MCU this whole time. Like, he went back and he had secretly been Peggy's husband this whole time. While all the other events of the movies played out, he was there this whole time. And even implied that Steve, that Steve's older self, he would have been there at Peggy's funeral, very close to his younger self. Now, I have a hard time believing this theory for several reasons. Although for one thing, in the main timeline, although we never learned the identity of Peggy's husband, it was revealed that she had gotten married and started a family. And Peggy even had her own, series on ABC, Agent Carter, which documented some of her adventures after World War II. That show ran for 2 seasons. And I'm thinking if Steve was truly going back in time to be with Peggy, why would he wait until a year or two after the war rather than travel back to moments after he crashed into the ice on the Red Skull's plane? Which which is kind of an interesting idea because if Steve goes into this new timeline, that would mean that there is another Steve Rogers variant in that timeline, one who is buried in the ice still, and as opposed to one who is not. Now, we'll touch on that a little bit later. My theory is that by going into the past to be with Peggy Carter, Steve had created an entirely new timeline for himself, one in which he has detailed knowledge of future events, from his timeline. Now, it's possible that he could have kept a low profile and spent the rest of his life as Peggy's husband and just put aside his knowledge of the future for the good of the timeline and just kind of let everything play out the way it normally did. But knowing Steve Rogers, I feel like he would have a hard time just sitting at home, not using his abilities to help people. You know, not using all that knowledge of the future. Knowing that his future in this new timeline could be whatever he wanted it to be, I feel like Captain America would absolutely use his knowledge of the future to help make the world a better place. For example, once he got back and reunited with Peggy, he would I imagine he would probably tell her everything that he had been through. He would probably tell Peggy and some of his trusted friends like Howard Stark. Now, I have a feeling that he would definitely want to warn them about how after World War II, Dr. Arnim Zola was responsible for allowing Hydra to infiltrate S.H.I.E.L.D. for decades. And I can't imagine Steve knowing this and not saying something to them. Not only would they want to put a stop to that as soon as possible, but Steve would absolutely want them to know that Bucky Barnes is alive and is being brainwashed into becoming the Winter Soldier. I imagine, dealing with Hydra and rescuing Bucky before he gets brainwashed too far would be priority number one. That would be the first order of business. I think that they would absolutely do that. From there, I imagine that Steve, Peggy, Howard, and Bucky would basically run S.H.I.E.L.D. for the next several decades, or at least become heavily involved in S.H.I.E.L.D. In the series on Disney Plus, The Falcon and the Winter Soldier, we learned about Isaiah Bradley and how he was experimented on in this secret program that where they experimented with Dr. Erskine's formula on African American soldiers, very in a way that was very similar to the real life Tuskegee experiments. Now, I imagine if Steve was aware of this happening, he would not condone that at all. Who knows? It's possible that maybe a young Isaiah Bradley, if he was turned into a super soldier, could become a powerful ally to Steve and Bucky if they ever met. As far as I know, Steve never really learned about that project, so I don't know if he would be aware of it or not. But if he was, I think he would definitely not go for that. Along the way, it would be hard to imagine that Captain America wouldn't get involved somehow in significant events throughout the rest of the 20th century, like the Korean War or the Vietnam War. What effect he would have on those wars, that would remain to be seen, but I imagine that his abilities and knowledge of the future would help him save a lot of lives. I could also imagine Steve doing his best to prevent major national tragedies, such as the multiple assassinations of President John F. Kennedy, Martin Luther King, Robert F. Kennedy during the 1960s. Those were, major events that had an impact on the country and on the world, really. Not that Steve could be everywhere at once, and who's to say that there still wouldn't be other tragedies that would occur? But things like that are an interesting thought. I imagine, knowing the character of Steve Rogers, you know, if he knew something like that was going to happen, he'd probably want to try something, want to try to do his best to stop it. You know, after all, it's a brand new timeline. It could be whatever he wants it to be. Not to saying that he could make everything perfect, but I feel like he would probably do something. Um, we also know that at some point in the late 60s and the early 70s, there was a brilliant young scientist by the name of Dr. Hank Pym, who first began working with Shield, developing the revolutionary Pym particle and becoming the first Ant-Man. Now, I could certainly see a scenario in which Steve Rogers, Bucky Barnes, Peggy Carter, and Howard Stark sort of become like mentors to a young Hank Pym or a young Janet Van Dyne, who was the original Wasp, as well as their colleague Dr. Bill Foster. We were introduced to him in the second Ant-Man and the Wasp movie, and he was played by Lawrence Fishburne. Dr. Bill Foster in the comics was a character called Goliath, and he could grow really giant. And they sort of implied the Goliath project in the movie Ant-Man and the Wasp. So I thought that was a cool little Easter egg. Who knows? Maybe they might also have a relationship with, Steve and Peggy and all them. That they might do their best to help mentor a younger Nick Fury. I imagine Steve would also recognize the value of the United States establishing a strong relationship, a friendly relationship with Wakanda. Perhaps one day Captain America could cross paths with T'Chaka, who was the father of T'Challa, who wore the mantle of the Black Panther in his youth, as did T'Challa's grandfather, T'Chanda. There's a whole history there. Maybe in this new timeline, they could almost be sort of like a early version or a precursor to the Avengers. Lots of possibilities there for storytelling. Who knows? Another interesting thing, who knows what kind of relationship that an older Steve Rogers would have with a young Tony Stark? Having been friends with his dad, maybe in this new timeline, he would watch Tony Stark grow up. He'd almost be like an uncle to him. That's kind of wild to think about. It's also worth noting that in the MCU, Dr. Bruce Banner becomes the Hulk at some point in the mid-2000s. The reason, if you saw the original Incredible Hulk movie in 2008, it was revealed that that Banner was tasked with recreating Dr. Erskine's original super soldier, the original super soldier formula by General Thaddeus Ross. Now, with Captain America having been alive for decades by this point in this new timeline, would Bruce have even become involved with an experiment like that? And that would change his whole life. He might have never become the Hulk. That's an interesting thing to think about. Excuse me. Another thing. In this new timeline, Steve would know that the Infinity Stones exist on Earth, that they're still out there. And I wonder what sort of precautions that he would take to ensure that this new timeline's variant of Thanos never becomes aware of their location. I think knowing what could happen, I think Steve would do everything he could to make sure that Thanos never comes to Earth, never figures out that Infinity Stones might be there. It makes me wonder if he would attempt to contact Asgard somehow and try to establish a relationship with them. We know that Thor is, in the main timeline, Thor was banished to Earth in 2011, where he first meets Dr. Jane Foster. That was in the first Thor movie. Now, I can't see that being too different in this timeline unless Steve was somehow able to contact Asgard at an earlier point in the timeline. Maybe he would have met Thor like several decades before Thor originally came to Earth in the main timeline. So maybe they could have established a relationship or a friendship there, and maybe they could have worked together. As far as keeping the Infinity Stones away from Thanos or anyone else who would want to use them. So, of course, the big question is how, in the main timeline in 2023, we saw the elderly Steve Rogers pass his shield and his mantle to Sam Wilson, seconds after he first went back in time. That's going to be a big sticking point as far as people are going to be like, well, how do you explain that? Well, I think that knowing how the Pym particle and the tech in, how the Pym particle works and how all the tech that the Avengers had in Avengers Endgame, how it allowed people to travel through space and time, I don't think it's out of the realm of possibility that Steve, even in his older age, would find a way to jump back into the original timeline to meet with Sam and to pass on the shield. I feel like he would do that, if nothing else, just as a way of tying up loose ends and just letting Sam and his friends know that he ended up doing okay. He ended up having a great life. I know that seems like a big logical leap for him to do something like that and to time it out perfectly, but given what we've seen about the multiverse and given what we know about who Steve Rogers is as a character, I don't think that's out of the realm of possibility, and that's the theory I'm going with. But like I mentioned before, that leaves another big question. If Steve goes back and creates this new timeline, wouldn't there be another variant of him from that timeline who is still stuck in the ice for decades after World War II? Do they ever do anything about that Steve Rogers? Does he eventually get discovered? Do they eventually free him? Then we have two Steve Rogerses. What happens then? There are so many different ways you can go with that. I know that theory is a bit of a mind bender, but that's one thing that I haven't quite been able to figure out. But it is something that occurred to me. If this alternate timeline theory is is to be believed or to go with. So, but anyways, that's my theory about how Captain America might have lived his life following the events of Avengers Endgame. I think there could be a lot of story possibilities there if Marvel ever wanted to explore either like an animation or something about what sort of an alternate timeline of a post-World War II world in which Captain America survived and continued his career throughout the rest of the century. So that I would definitely want to see that story. I'd be interested in reading it or watching it or whatever they end up doing with it. I don't think Chris Evans would ever come back for something like that, but you never know. I mean, the fact that Chris Evans was done with the role. I think that's why they ended things the way they did in that movie. But that's why that decision was made. But what do you guys think? How do you think that Steve Rogers' life might have turned out after Endgame? Feel free to let me know in the comments. I'd be interested to hear some of your theories, some lingering questions you might have whenever you think about the way they left that character at the end of the movie. And besides that, make sure thank you guys for tuning in. Of course, make sure you follow me on Twitter and Instagram at jackxconnor. You can like me on Facebook at facebook.com/jackconnormusic. You can I play in a rock band, Vertebraker. You can check us out at facebook.com/vertebrakerband. And I also play in a Linkin Park tribute band called New Divide. You can check us out, facebook.com/New Divide Band. I'll have all the links in the description. As always, if you have any questions, comments, suggestions, make sure you leave a comment, or you can email me at jackconnorpodcast@gmail.com. You could tweet me with the hashtag Phoenix Report. I'll have an audio copy of this as well, probably on YouTube or Apple or on other podcasts. But this is mainly a YouTube thing as far as being a video and me talking to you here. But make sure you subscribe, leave a good review, hit the notification bell, do all the things, leave a comment. Feel free to go back and listen to the other episodes. I have another playlist full of fan theories like this, so feel free to check them out. And thanks as always for tuning in. Have a good day.